It was just another ordinary afternoon in the heart of the city, or so it seemed. The sun hung high, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. People hurried about their day, lost in their own worlds, unaware of the storm about to unfold. On the corner of 5th and Main, a black man in his late 20s, Marcus, stood waiting for the crosswalk signal. He was dressed casually, a backpack slung over one shoulder, his demeanor calm and unassuming. But in a matter of seconds, everything would change. A police cruiser pulled up abruptly, its tires screeching against the pavement. The officer stepped out, his face hard, his voice sharp as he barked orders at Marcus. "Hands where I can see them. Now!" Marcus froze, confusion and fear flashing across his face. He complied immediately, raising his hands slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's going on, officer?" he asked, his voice steady, but laced with unease. The cop didn't answer. Instead, he moved closer, his hand resting on his holstered weapon, his eyes scanning Marcus as if he were a threat. Passers-by began to stop, their phones already out, recording the scene. The tension was palpable, the air thick with uncertainty. Marcus tried to explain, to reason with the officer, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The cop's tone grew harsher, his accusations more pointed. "You fit the description of a suspect we're looking for," he snapped. "Stay still." Marcus's mind raced. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He'd heard stories like this before, stories that didn't always end well. His breath quickened as the officer moved in, his hand now gripping Marcus's arm tightly. "You're coming with me," the cop said, his voice cold. Marcus's stomach dropped. He knew he had to stay calm, but the fear was overwhelming. Just as the officer began to cuff him, a black SUV screeched to a halt nearby. The doors flew open, and 4 men in dark suits stepped out, their presence commanding immediate attention. They moved with precision, their eyes locked on the scene, unfolding before them. The cop hesitated, his grip on Marcus loosening slightly as he turned to face the newcomers. "What's going on here?" one of the men asked, his voice calm but firm. He flashed a badge, the words, "Secret Service," gleaming in the sunlight. The cop's expression shifted, his confidence wavering. Marcus, still caught in the grip of the officer, looked at the men in suits, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Who were they? Why were they here? The lead agent stepped closer, his gaze steady as he addressed the cop. "You need to let him go. Now." The tension in the air was electric, the standoff holding everyone in its grip. The cop's jaw tightened, his eyes darting between Marcus and the agents. For a moment it seemed like he might resist, but then, slowly, he released Marcus's arm. Marcus stumbled back, his heart still racing, his mind a whirlwind of questions. The agents moved in, forming a protective circle around him. The cop took a step back, his face a mix of frustration and confusion. "What's the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice tinged with anger. The lead agent didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to Marcus, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone genuine. Marcus nodded, still, too shaken to speak. The agent then turned back to the cop, his demeanor shifting once more. "This man is under our protection. You'll need to take this up with us." The cop's eyes widened, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the situation. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The agents began to guide Marcus toward the SUV, their movements deliberate and efficient. As they moved, Marcus couldn't help but glance back at the cop who stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. The crowd that had gathered watched in stunned silence, their phones still recording, capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. Just as Marcus was about to step into the SUV, the lead agent paused, turning to address the cop one last time. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low but firm. "We'll be in touch." With that, the door closed and the SUV sped off, leaving the cop and the onlookers in its wake. The scene was left hanging in a cloud of unresolved tension, the questions swirling in everyone's minds. Who was Marcus? Why was he under the protection of the Secret Service? And what would happen next? The answers were still out of reach. The story far from over. As the SUV disappeared into the distance, the cop stood alone, his earlier confidence shattered, the weight of his actions settling heavily on his shoulders. The crowd began to disperse, but the air remained thick with unease. Something big was happening, something that no one could yet fully understand. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the city, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The black SUV sped through the city streets, weaving through traffic with practiced ease. Inside, Marcus sat in silence, his mind racing. The agents around him were calm, their expressions unreadable. He wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. The lead agent, who had introduced himself as Agent Harris, glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "You're safe now," he said, his voice steady, "but we need to get you somewhere secure." Marcus nodded, though he still didn't fully understand what was happening. His life had just been turned upside down in a matter of minutes, and he was struggling to keep up. As the SUV moved further away from the scene, Marcus's thoughts drifted back to the cop. The man's face, filled with anger and confusion, lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was at play. Why had the cop targeted him, and why had the Secret Service intervened? The questions swirled in his head, but there were no answers, not yet. Agent Harris seemed to sense Marcus's unease. "We'll explain everything soon," he said, his tone reassuring. "But first, we need to make sure you're out of harm's way." Marcus nodded again, though his anxiety only grew. He couldn't help but feel like a pawn in a game he didn't know the rules to. The SUV eventually pulled into a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. The agents ushered Marcus inside, their movements quick and efficient. The interior was stark, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and a faint smell of disinfectant in the air. They led him to a small room with a table and 2 chairs, then closed the door behind them. Marcus sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to steady his nerves. A few moments later, Agent Harris entered, holding a file in his hand. He sat across from Marcus, his expression serious but not unkind. "I know you have a lot of questions," he began, "and I'll do my best to answer them. But first, I need to ask you something." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locked on Harris. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harris opened the file and slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of a man in his early 30s, with sharp features and a serious expression. Marcus frowned, studying the image. "Do you recognize this man?" Harris asked. Marcus shook his head. "No, I don't think so. Who is he?" Harris hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "His name is Daniel Carter. He's a person of interest in an ongoing investigation, and we believe he may have been trying to contact you." Marcus's eyes widened. "Me? Why? I've never even heard of him." Harris leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Daniel Carter is involved in something significant, and for some reason he seems to think you're connected to it." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "Connected how?" "I don't know anything about this guy or whatever he's involved in." Harris nodded, as if he had expected that response. "We believe you," he said. "But the fact remains that Carter has been trying to reach you, and that makes you a target." Marcus's heart sank. A target? For what? He had always lived a quiet life, working as a freelance graphic designer and keeping to himself. He didn't have enemies, he didn't even have many friends. How could he possibly be involved in something like this? Harris seemed to sense his growing panic. "We're going to protect you," he said firmly. "But we need your cooperation. Anything you can tell us, no matter how small, could help us figure out what's going on." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. "I don't know what to tell you," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I don't know this guy. I don't know why he'd be interested in me. This doesn't make any sense." Harris studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's start from the beginning. Tell me about your day. Everything that happened before the incident with the cop." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to recall the details. I woke up late, he began. Had some coffee, checked my emails. I was supposed to meet a client downtown, but they canceled last minute, so I decided to grab lunch instead. I was on my way to the cafe when, well, you know the rest. Harris listened intently, his pen moving across a notepad as he jotted down notes. Did anything unusual happen? Any strange calls or messages? Anyone following you? Marcus shook his head. Not that I noticed. It was just a normal day. Until it wasn't. Harris leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. What about your family? Anyone who might have a connection to Carter? Marcus frowned. My family? No, I don't think so. My parents live out of state, and I don't have any siblings. I'm not close with my extended family either. Harris nodded, though he didn't seem entirely satisfied. All right, he said. We'll keep digging. In the meantime, you'll stay here. It's the safest place for you right now. Marcus's stomach churned at the thought of being stuck in this sterile, unfamiliar place. How long will I have to stay? He asked, his voice tinged with desperation. As long as it takes, Harris replied. We'll do everything we can to resolve this quickly, but until we know more, you're not safe out there. Marcus leaned back in his chair, feeling utterly overwhelmed. He wanted to argue, to demand to be let go, but he knew it was pointless. The agents weren't going to budge. And deep down, he knew they were right. He wasn't safe. Not until they figured out why Daniel Carter was after him. As Harris stood to leave, Marcus spoke up. Wait, he said. What about the cop? What's going to happen to him? Harris paused, his hand on the doorknob. We're looking into that, he said, but right now, our priority is you. With that, he left the room, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. The hours dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. Marcus tried to distract himself by pacing the room, but the walls seemed to close in around him. He couldn't stop thinking about the cop, about the way the man had looked at him with such hostility. Had it been a case of mistaken identity, or was there something more to it? And then there was Daniel Carter. Who was he? What did he want? The questions gnawed at Marcus, leaving him restless and uneasy. Eventually, the door opened again, and Agent Harris returned, this time with a laptop in hand. We've been going through your background, he said, setting the laptop on the table, and we found something interesting. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. What is it? Harris opened the laptop and turned it toward Marcus. On the screen was a series of emails, all sent from an unknown address. The subject lines were vague, but the content was chilling. We think these are from Carter, Harris said. He's been trying to reach you for weeks. Marcus's eyes scanned the messages, his stomach twisting with each word. The emails were cryptic, filled with references to things Marcus didn't understand. But one thing was clear. Carter believed Marcus held the key to something important. Don't know what any of this means, Marcus said, his voice trembling. I swear I have no idea what he's talking about. Harris nodded, his expression grim. We believe you, he said. But Carter doesn't. And that's what makes this so dangerous. Marcus felt a wave of despair wash over him. What am I supposed to do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harris placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. We'll figure this out, he said. But for now, you need to trust us. As Harris left the room once more, Marcus slumped, in his chair, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. He felt like he was trapped in a nightmare with no way out, and as the minutes ticked by, the weight of the situation pressed down on him, leaving him with one burning question. What did Daniel Carter want from him? The answer was still out of reach, but one thing was certain: this was far from over.